3 days ago, I was Joaquin Ramirez, a union scaffolder from Chicago working a routine construction job in Savannah. Then the water turned poisonous, and people started turning into red-eyed killers. While everyone else ran for the exits, I did what scaffolders do best. I went up. The ground belonged to them now, but I had 16 years of climbing experience and a truck full of construction tools that just became the difference between life and death. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. I'm telling you this from 200 feet above what used to be downtown Savannah. If you're watching this, you're probably wondering how a construction worker ended up being one of the few people who figured out how to survive the first 72 hours. The answer is simple. When the ground isn't safe, you go up. My name is Joaquin Ramirez. I've been a union scaffolder with Local 600 and 8 out of Chicago for 16 years. Started as an apprentice when I was 18, worked my way up through every kind of job you can imagine. High rises, industrial plants, bridge repairs, you name it. If it needed scaffolding, I've probably built it. 3 days ago, I was just another construction worker putting up metal pipes and platforms so other guys could do their jobs. Today, those same skills are the only reason I'm still breathing. I'd been in Savannah for 2 weeks working on this historical renovation project on Bull Street. Beautiful old building from the 1800s, needed exterior work done the right way to preserve all that fancy architecture. The kind of job that pays well because it's detailed work, requires experienced hands who know how to work around delicate stonework and original materials. My crew was scheduled to wrap up that Friday, October 15th, and I was already planning my weekend drive back home to Chicago. Had my truck packed with all my gear, tools organized the way I like them, even had a cooler ready for the road trip. I was staying at the Hampton in downtown, nothing fancy but clean and close enough to the job site that I could walk if I wanted to. Room 418, 4th floor, decent view of the city. The hotel had this breakfast setup in the lobby, free coffee that wasn't terrible, and Wi-Fi that actually worked most of the time. After 2 weeks of the same routine, I knew every staff member by name. Marcus worked the night shift at the front desk, always friendly when I came down for my morning coffee. Mrs. Chen was in room 312, traveling with her husband, seemed like nice people. Sarah from housekeeping always made sure my room was ready when I got back from work. That Thursday night, October 14th, I went to bed around 10:30 like always. Set my phone alarm for 5:45, laid out my work clothes, checked the weather forecast one more time. Clear skies, good temperature for working outdoors. Everything normal, everything routine. The kind of boring, predictable night that you never think twice about until you realize it was the last normal night you'll ever have. When I woke up that morning, the first thing I noticed was the water. I always brush my teeth first thing, splash some cold water on my face to wake up properly. But the water coming out of the bathroom faucet tasted wrong. Not just stale hotel water wrong, but metallic, almost chemical. Like someone had mixed copper pennies with bleach and called it water. I spit it out, tried the shower instead, thinking maybe it was just the bathroom sink. Same taste, same weird metallic quality that made my tongue feel numb. I should have paid more attention to that. Should have wondered why hotel water would suddenly taste like metal and chemicals. Should have remembered those news reports from 3 days earlier about civil unrest in Atlanta. About water contamination warnings that the CDC was investigating. But I was focused on finishing the job, getting home to Chicago, maybe catching a Cubs game over the weekend. You know how it is when you're in routine mode. Your brain filters out the stuff that doesn't seem immediately important. That metallic water taste seemed like just another minor annoyance in a long list of minor annoyances that come with staying in hotels for work. I grabbed my hard hat from the dresser, pulled on my steel-toed boots, and was reaching for my tool belt when the screaming started. High-pitched, terrified screaming from somewhere on the 3rd floor. The kind of sound that cuts right through hotel walls and gets your attention whether you want it or not. My first thought was construction accident. After 16 years in this business, you develop an ear for the sounds of people in serious trouble. Falls, equipment failures, electrical shocks, they all produce different kinds of screams. This sounded like someone had fallen hard and was hurt bad. I grabbed my hard hat and headed for the door. In construction, when someone screams like that, you drop what you're doing and you help. That's not just union brotherhood, that's basic human decency. Plus, I had my first aid certification, knew how to stabilize someone until paramedics arrived. Figured maybe some guest had slipped in the shower or tried to move furniture and threw out their back. Simple stuff that happens all the time in hotels. The hallway was quiet except for the screaming, which was getting louder and more desperate. I was still pulling on my steel-toed boots, hopping on one foot while I tried to get the laces tight, when I saw Mrs. Chen from room 312 stumbling toward me. At first glance, she looked drunk or sick. Her gait was all wrong, jerky and uncoordinated like someone who'd had too much to drink and was trying to navigate an unfamiliar hallway. But when she got closer, I saw her eyes. They weren't just bloodshot. They were completely red, like someone had filled them with bright red paint. No white showing at all, just solid crimson that seemed to glow under the fluorescent hallway lights. Her mouth hung open, dark, thick drool streaming down her chin and onto her nightgown. She was making this low, growling sound deep in her throat. Not human, not animal, something in between that made every instinct I had start screaming danger. When she saw me, something changed. The stumbling became purposeful. The growling got louder. She fixed those red eyes on me and lunged forward with her arms stretched out like she was trying to grab something. Her fingers were bent into claws, her mouth open wide enough that I could see her teeth were stained dark red. She moved with the kind of desperate hunger you see in starving animals, except there was intelligence behind it. Calculated, focused intelligence that knew exactly what it wanted. 16 years of construction work teaches you to react fast when something goes wrong. You see a beam start to fall, you don't stop to think about it. You just move. Same thing when Mrs. Chen hit me. She slammed into my chest with enough force to knock me back against the wall, her fingernails clawing at my face, while her teeth snapped inches from my throat. The only thing that saved me was my hard hat. When she drove me back against the wall, my head would have cracked like an eggshell without that protection. I managed to shove her away, harder than I wanted to, but hard enough to create some distance. She stumbled backward but didn't fall, just regrouped and came at me again. This time I was ready for her. I sidestepped and headed for the stairwell, my work boots pounding against the hotel carpet. Behind me I could hear her following, still making that inhuman growling sound. But now there were other sounds too, more screaming from different rooms, doors slamming, people shouting for help. The lobby was complete chaos. Guests in pajamas and hotel robes were running in every direction while others with the same red eyes and violent movements, chased them with inhuman speed. I watched Marcus, the night desk clerk who'd always been friendly when I grabbed my morning coffee, tackle an elderly guest near the front desk. The sound that followed, the wet tearing noise, made my stomach turn. I'd seen construction accidents that left people bloody and broken, but nothing like what Marcus was doing to that man. Near the elevator bank, a woman in a hotel bathrobe was cornering a family with two young kids. She moved like Mrs. Chen had moved, with that same jerky but purposeful gait, those same solid red eyes. The family was pressed against the elevator doors, the father trying to shield his wife and children with his body. The woman was making that same growling sound, circling them like a predator deciding which one to take first. I wanted to help them. Every instinct told me to grab something heavy and stop what was happening. But more of those red-eyed things were pouring out of the stairwells and elevators. Too many to fight, too many to avoid. The main exits were blocked by clusters of them, and they seemed to be coordinating somehow, working together to cut off escape routes. I'd never seen anything like it, but my construction brain was already working the problem. When the ground floor exits are compromised, you find another way out. In construction, that usually means going up. I had left my truck in the back parking lot, loaded with all my scaffolding gear and climbing equipment. 16 years worth of ropes, harnesses, carabiners, and tools that could mean the difference between life and death if I could reach them. But the rear exit was blocked by two more of those things, and they'd positioned themselves where they could see anyone trying to get past. Smart positioning, tactical thinking that shouldn't have been possible if these were just sick people or drug addicts, or whatever logical explanation my brain was trying to find. The emergency stairs led to the roof, and that's where I went. 4 floors up, taking the steps 3 at a time while the chaos in the lobby got worse behind me. By the time I reached the roof access door, my lungs were burning and my heart was hammering against my ribs. I pushed through the door and stepped out into the early morning sunlight, then turned around and used my tool belt to wedge the door shut. Not a permanent solution, but it would buy me some time to think. From the roof of the Hampton Inn, I could see the whole city spread out below me. Smoke was rising from at least a dozen locations across Savannah. Cars were crashed in intersections, their doors hanging open like people had just abandoned them in the middle of driving. In the distance, I could hear sirens, but they sounded wrong, too few and too scattered for a city this size dealing with a major emergency. There should have been dozens of emergency vehicles, coordinated response, the organized chaos of professional first responders doing their jobs. Instead, I heard maybe 3 or 4 sirens total, and they kept getting cut off mid-wail. My phone had no signal, which was unusual because I'd had good coverage all over Savannah during my 2 weeks there. I tried calling 911 anyway, got nothing but dead air. Tried calling my union hall back in Chicago, thinking maybe they'd heard something on the news about what was happening down here. Dead air again. Tried calling my ex-wife, my buddy Pete, even my sister in Milwaukee. Nothing. Either the cell towers were down or something was jamming all communication. During those first few minutes on the roof, I managed to grab my climbing gear from my hotel room. The door to the stairwell was still wedged shut, and I could hear those things pounding on it from the other side, but the wedge was holding. I rappelled down the side of the building using the scaffolding I'd helped install on the neighboring construction site. 16 years of working at height had taught me that when you need to get somewhere fast and safe, you use the tools you know best. By the time I reached my truck, the sun was fully up and I could see them everywhere. Fast, aggressive, and absolutely relentless. They moved in ways that defied everything I thought I knew about human limitations. I watched one of them leap from a second-story window and land on its feet, then immediately start chasing someone down the street. Another one climbed a chain-link fence like it was a ladder, moving with coordination that should have been impossible for someone in that condition. But here's what really got my attention. They were working together, not like a mob or a riot where everyone's just following the crowd. They were communicating somehow, coordinating their movements, setting up what looked like tactical positions to cut off escape routes. I saw a group of them split up to surround a car that was trying to navigate around some debris. They didn't just attack randomly, they flanked it, forced it into a dead end, then attacked as a unit. That kind of behavior requires planning, communication, intelligence. My truck started on the first try, thank God, and I had a full tank of gas. The bed was loaded with all my scaffolding equipment, tools that suddenly looked a lot more useful as weapons than as construction gear. My 4-foot level could crack skulls. My pipe wrenches could break bones. My climbing ropes and harnesses could get me places these things couldn't follow. For the first time since Mrs. Chen had attacked me in the hotel hallway, I felt like maybe I had a chance. The radio in my truck was picking up emergency broadcasts, but they were fragmented and contradictory. One station was saying this was a terrorist attack on the water supply. Another was calling it a biological weapon. A third was describing it as some kind of rabies outbreak that had mutated beyond recognition. But all of them agreed on the basic facts. It had started in Atlanta 3 days ago. It was spreading through contaminated water. Anyone who drank the water had about 12 hours before they turned into those red-eyed killers. And the government response was failing completely. That's when I made the connection. The metallic taste in the hotel water. The news reports from Atlanta about water contamination that I'd ignored. The fact that everyone who'd turned had been staying in the hotel, drinking the same water, eating food prepared with that same water. I'd tasted the contamination that morning and spit it out. Pure luck, nothing more. If I'd been thirstier, if I'd ignored the weird taste and drank it anyway, I'd be down there with the rest of them, hunting the living with nothing but hunger and violence driving me forward. As I drove north on Interstate 95, watching Savannah burn in my rearview mirror, I realized that everything I'd known about the world had ended in the span of a single morning. The real question wasn't how to survive the next few hours. The question was whether there would be anything left of civilization to survive in. But I had advantages that most people didn't. 16 years of working in dangerous conditions had taught me to stay calm under pressure, to analyze problems logically, and to use whatever tools were available to solve them. I knew how to work at height, how to move safely through unstable environments, how to jury-rig solutions when the proper equipment wasn't available. My truck was loaded with equipment that most people wouldn't know how to use, but that could mean the difference between life and death in the right hands. More importantly, I was starting to understand the rules of this new world. The infected moved fast, but they seemed to avoid heights. They were intelligent enough to coordinate attacks, but not creative enough to solve complex problems. They were drawn to noise and movement, but could be distracted or misdirected. They were incredibly strong and aggressive, but they still had human limitations when it came to climbing, jumping, and navigating obstacles. The radio chatter was getting more desperate as the morning wore on. Reports of major cities going dark, military units being overrun, government officials evacuating to undisclosed locations. It was becoming clear that whatever help might be coming, it wasn't going to arrive anytime soon. We were on our own, and the sooner we accepted that reality, the better our chances of staying alive. I found my first group of survivors around noon, maybe 20 miles north of Savannah. A family had barricaded themselves in a truck stop, using overturned tables and vending machines to block the doors and windows. Smart thinking, but they were trapped with no way out and no plan beyond waiting for rescue that wasn't coming. I used my climbing gear to get onto the roof, then dropped ropes down so they could escape through an upper window. Basic scaffolding techniques, the kind of thing I did every day on construction sites, but to them, it looked like magic. That's when I realized that my skills weren't just useful for my own survival. In a world where the ground had become deadly, the ability to move safely at height, to create elevated escape routes, to access resources that others couldn't reach, these weren't just advantages. They were lifelines that could save dozens, maybe hundreds of people if I used them right. The truck stop family told me what they'd seen during their 12 hours of being trapped. The infected were getting more organized as time went on. At first, they'd moved in small groups or as individuals, attacking randomly whenever they encountered living people. But by the second day, they were forming larger packs, coordinating their movements, setting up what looked like territorial boundaries around key resources like water sources and food supplies. Even more disturbing, they seemed to be learning from their encounters with survivors. Early on, people had been able to escape simply by climbing onto car roofs or up trees. But the infected were adapting, finding ways to reach higher ground, working together to create human ladders or knock down obstacles. They were problem-solving in ways that suggested they retained more human intelligence than anyone wanted to admit. The radio was painting an even darker picture. Military bases were reporting coordinated attacks that suggested the infected had some kind of command structure. Major cities were being evacuated not because of random violence, but because of organized assaults that targeted key infrastructure. Power grids, water treatment plants, communication centers, all being systematically destroyed or overrun. This wasn't a disease outbreak or a riot. This was something approaching warfare, fought by an enemy that had once been human, but was rapidly becoming something else entirely. As the afternoon wore on, I realized that everything I thought I knew about survival was going to have to change. The old rules about finding shelter, securing resources, and waiting for rescue didn't apply when the enemy could think, plan, and adapt. We were going to have to think like them, move like them, evolve as fast as they were evolving, or we were all going to die. But I had something they didn't. 16 years of experience solving problems 300 feet above the ground, where one mistake could kill you and there's no room for panic or poor planning. I knew how to stay calm when everything around me was falling apart. I knew how to use tools and equipment in ways their designers never intended. Most importantly, I knew that sometimes the most dangerous plan is the only one that works. The truck was running low on gas, and I was starting to see infected moving in larger groups along the interstate. It was time to find a place to make a stand, to start building something more permanent than just running and hiding. Somewhere I could use my skills to create a real advantage. A base of operations that could serve as a refuge for other survivors and a launching point for rescue missions. That's when I spotted the construction site just north of Brunswick. A high-rise project that had been abandoned mid-construction, probably 40 stories of concrete and steel reaching up into the sky. The kind of vertical maze that would be a nightmare for ground-based attackers, but paradise for someone who knew how to move safely at height. The kind of place where 16 years of scaffolding experience could turn into the ultimate survival advantage. I thought day one was bad. I had no idea what day two would bring, or how everything I thought I knew about survival was about to be proven wrong. That first night, I made every mistake you could make. I'm going to tell you about them so you don't repeat them if you're ever in this situation. The construction site I'd chosen looked perfect during daylight hours. 40 stories of concrete and steel, multiple access points, plenty of materials to work with. But I'd made the classic rookie mistake of not thinking about what it would be like after dark. I'd parked my truck on the third level of the parking structure, thinking that would give me a quick escape route if I needed it. Used my climbing gear to set up a temporary shelter on the 15th floor, right where the building frame was most stable. Had a clear view of the surrounding area, multiple escape routes if things went bad, access to construction materials I could use for defense or to build better shelter. On paper, it was a solid plan. In reality, it almost got me killed. The infected have better night vision than anyone expected. During the day, they moved like people who were disoriented, squinting in the sunlight, sometimes stumbling over obstacles they should have seen coming. But when the sun went down, something changed. They moved with confidence, navigating in darkness like they could see everything perfectly. I watched them from my 15th floor position, using binoculars I'd found in a site trailer, and their coordination was terrifying. They weren't just wandering around randomly anymore. They were patrolling in organized groups, covering specific territories, communicating with each other through sounds I couldn't quite identify. Not voices, not exactly, but rhythmic clicking and growling that seemed to carry information. When one group found something interesting, others would converge on their location within minutes. They were sharing intelligence, coordinating searches, working together in ways that suggested they'd retained far more human cognitive ability than anyone wanted to admit. Around midnight, I made my second major mistake. I'd brought some canned food from the truck stop, and I opened one without thinking about the smell. 30 seconds later, I heard them gathering at the base of the construction site. Not just a few, but dozens of them, making those coordinated sounds that I was starting to recognize as their form of communication. They detected the food smell from 15 stories down and were organizing a response. I spent the rest of that night moving between floors, never staying in one place for more than 20 minutes. They were definitely trying to reach me, and they were getting creative about it. I watched groups of them working together to stack debris, creating crude ramps and platforms they could use to reach higher levels. They weren't just mindlessly aggressive anymore. They were problem-solving, adapting their tactics, learning from failed attempts. But here's what really scared me. When they couldn't reach me directly, they started testing the structure itself. Groups of them would slam into support pillars, shake scaffolding systems, try to destabilize anything that looked like it might collapse. They understood that bringing down my elevated position was just as effective as climbing up to reach me. These weren't mindless monsters anymore. They were thinking tactically, using strategy that required planning and coordination. The psychological pressure was worse than the physical danger. 16 years of construction work had taught me to function on minimal sleep, but this was different. This was the kind of hypervigilance that burns through your mental reserves faster than you can replace them. Every sound had to be analyzed. Every shadow had to be checked. Every few minutes, you had to relocate to stay ahead of their search patterns. By dawn, I was exhausted in ways I'd never experienced before. When the sun came up on day 2, I could see the full scope of what had happened overnight. The infected had established a perimeter around the construction site, posting what looked like sentries at key positions. They weren't just hunting randomly anymore. They were laying siege, cutting off my escape routes, settling in for a sustained operation. The implications of that level of organizational thinking were terrifying. From my elevated position, I could see smoke rising from dozens of locations across the region. Not just random fires, but coordinated destruction that targeted specific types of infrastructure. Power substations, communication towers, fuel depots, all burning in patterns that suggested systematic sabotage rather than random violence. Someone or something was directing these attacks, prioritizing targets that would cripple organized resistance and force survivors into isolation. My truck radio was still picking up emergency broadcasts, but they were getting more fragmented and desperate as the hours passed. Reports of major cities going completely dark, military units losing contact with command, government officials, evacuating to locations that were then overrun within hours. The pattern was consistent across the country. Organized resistance was collapsing faster than anyone had thought possible. But I was starting to hear something else in those radio transmissions. References to different types of infected behavior. Classifications that suggested the medical and military people were seeing the same evolution I was witnessing firsthand. They were calling them Class 1 and Class 2 infected, with hints that even higher classifications were emerging. Class 1 were the basic infected, fast and aggressive but still operating on instinct. Class 2 showed coordinated behavior, tool use, basic problem-solving ability. Number 1 was talking about what Class 3 might look like, but the fear in their voices suggested it was something nobody wanted to encounter. Around 8 in the morning, I spotted my first group of living survivors since the truck stop family. 3 adults and 2 kids, holed up in a house about half a mile from the construction site. They'd barricaded the windows and doors, but I could see infected circling the building, testing their defenses, looking for weak points. The family was trapped, and it was only a matter of time before those things found a way in. This was where my scaffolding expertise became a real lifesaver. I used my climbing gear to create a zip line system between the construction site and a water tower that was closer to the trapped family. From there, I could access the roof of their house and extract them through an upstairs window. It took 3 hours to set up the system properly, testing every connection, making sure the angles were right, and the load calculations would work with multiple people. The family told me their story while I rigged the extraction system. They'd been lucky enough to be camping when the outbreak started, drinking bottled water instead of tap water. But when they'd returned home 2 days later, their neighborhood was overrun. They'd managed to reach their house and barricade themselves in, but they'd been watching the infected behavior evolve hour by hour. First day, the things had just wandered around randomly, attacking whatever they encountered. Second day, they'd started working in groups, coordinating their movements, setting up what looked like hunting patterns. The father, a guy named Jim who worked as an electrician, had been tracking the infected movements from his second-story window. He'd noticed they were avoiding certain areas, clustering around others, establishing what looked like territorial boundaries. More disturbing, they seemed to be setting up camps near key resources. Water sources, food storage facilities, fuel depots, all had permanent infected populations that didn't wander off to hunt. They were guarding these locations, which meant they understood strategic value and resource management. The extraction went smoothly. All 5 family members safely transported to the construction site using the zip line system. But during the operation, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The infected weren't just watching us work. They were studying the zip line system, examining the anchor points, testing the support structures. They were learning from our tactics, figuring out how we were moving between elevated positions. Next time, they'd be ready for zip lines. Jim turned out to be incredibly valuable because electrical work requires the same kind of systematic thinking that scaffolding does. You have to understand load calculations, structural integrity, safety redundancy, all the technical details that keep complex systems functioning safely. Together, we started turning the construction site into something approaching a real fortress rather than just a temporary hiding place. We used my scaffolding expertise and his electrical knowledge to create multiple escape routes, backup power systems, communication equipment that could monitor radio traffic across multiple frequencies. Most importantly, we started building elevated bridges between nearby buildings, creating a network of safe movement that kept us off the ground level where the infected dominated. It was slow work, requiring careful planning and precise execution, but each connection gave us more options, more flexibility, more ways to escape if our main position was compromised. The kids, 8 and 10 years old, turned out to be natural climbers. Kids that age don't have the fear of heights that develops in adults, and they adapted to the safety equipment faster than their parents. Within hours, they were moving through our elevated system with confidence, following safety protocols without questioning why they were necessary. In this new world, those climbing skills weren't just fun playground activities. They were survival skills that could mean the difference between life and death. By midday, we'd established contact with other survivor groups through Jim's radio equipment. There were pockets of people scattered across the region, some in similar elevated positions, others trapped in various buildings and vehicles. Most were running low on supplies. All were reporting the same evolution in infected behavior. The things were getting smarter, more organized, more dangerous with each passing hour. One group was holed up in a grain elevator about 10 miles north. Another had taken refuge in a cell phone tower maintenance building. A third was trapped on the upper floors of a hospital that had been overrun on the first day. All of them were in defensible positions, but none had the mobility to reach supplies or help other survivors. They were safe for the moment, but safety without sustainability was just a slow death sentence. That's when I realized what my real role was going to be in this new world. My scaffolding skills weren't just useful for my own survival. They were the key to creating mobility, to connecting isolated survivor groups, to building the kind of network that could sustain organized resistance. Every zip line I rigged, every climbing route I established, every elevated bridge I constructed was another link in a chain that could keep humanity connected even when the ground belonged to the enemy. But we were racing against time. The radio traffic was getting more desperate throughout the afternoon. Military units were reporting coordinated attacks that suggested the infected had developed command structures, strategic thinking, tactical planning that rivaled organized military operations. They weren't just killing people anymore. They were systematically destroying the infrastructure that modern civilization depended on, forcing survivors into smaller and smaller pockets of resistance that could be eliminated one by one. Around 4 in the afternoon, we got our first close look at what the radio operators were calling Class 2 infected. A group of them had gathered at the base of our construction site, but instead of just trying to climb or bring down the structure, they were organizing construction materials. Steel beams, concrete blocks, scaffolding pipes, all being arranged in patterns that suggested they were building something. Not randomly stacking debris, but actual construction with purpose and planning. Jim watched them through binoculars for over an hour, tracking their movements, trying to understand what they were building. His conclusion was chilling. They were constructing a siege engine, a ramp system that would allow them to reach higher levels of the building. They were using human engineering principles, understanding concepts like load distribution and structural stability. These weren't mindless monsters anymore. They were intelligent enemies who could learn, adapt, and innovate. The implications were staggering. If they could build siege equipment, they could eventually overcome any fixed defensive position. If they understood engineering principles, they could sabotage infrastructure in more sophisticated ways than just brute force destruction. If they were developing command structures and strategic thinking, they could coordinate attacks across vast distances, overwhelming any organized resistance through superior numbers and tactical planning. But there was something else happening that was even more disturbing. The infected weren't just learning from their encounters with survivors. They were retaining information, sharing knowledge between groups, building on previous discoveries. I watched one group examine the anchor points from our zip line system, then move to a different part of the construction site and start testing similar structures. They were applying lessons learned from one situation to completely different scenarios. That kind of knowledge transfer required communication, memory, and abstract reasoning that shouldn't have been possible given what we knew about their condition. As evening approached, we faced a critical decision: stay in our current position and hope our defenses could withstand whatever siege equipment they were building, or abandon the construction site and try to reach one of the other survivor groups. Both options carried massive risks. Moving meant exposing ourselves during the most dangerous part of the day, when their night vision gave them maximum advantage. Staying meant facing an unknown number of increasingly intelligent enemies who were specifically preparing to assault our position. The radio made the decision for us. The grain elevator group reported that they were under coordinated attack by what had to be hundreds of infected, all moving with military precision, all following what appeared to be a specific tactical plan. The cell phone tower group had gone silent completely, their last transmission cutting off mid-sentence. The hospital group was reporting that infected inside the building were systematically destroying medical equipment, not just attacking randomly but targeting specific types of technology. We were witnessing the collapse of organized resistance in real time, and staying in any fixed position was becoming a death sentence. The infected were learning faster than we were adapting, evolving tactics that countered every defensive strategy survivors had developed. Our only advantage was mobility, the ability to move between elevated positions faster than they could organize responses. But even that advantage was temporary. They were learning our movement patterns, studying our techniques, preparing countermeasures that would eliminate our tactical superiority. The extraction from the construction site required every piece of climbing gear I had and all of Jim's electrical equipment. We couldn't take the scaffolding materials with us, but we could create a temporary bridge system that would get us to the next building in our network. From there, we'd have to improvise, using whatever materials we could scavenge to maintain our elevated position. The family moved first, the kids leading the way because they were lightest and most agile. Jim and I followed, carrying essential supplies and equipment. The whole operation took less than 10 minutes, but it felt like hours with those things gathering below us, watching our every move, analyzing our techniques. By the time we reached the next building, they were already testing the structures we'd used, learning how to counter our tactics for next time. From our new position, we could see the construction site being systematically dismantled by organized teams of infected, not destroyed randomly, but carefully taken apart in ways that suggested they understood how the structures functioned, how to safely remove load-bearing elements without causing uncontrolled collapse. They were salvaging materials, organizing resources, building stockpiles that could be used for future construction projects. The radio traffic was getting more desperate as night approached. Military frequencies were reporting that conventional tactics were failing because the enemy was adapting faster than doctrine could be updated. Civilian emergency services had largely stopped responding because first responders were being systematically targeted and eliminated. Government coordination was breaking down because communication centers were being destroyed faster than they could be rebuilt or relocated. But we'd learned something important during our 14 hours at the construction site. The infected were intelligent and organized, but they were still following recognizable patterns. They established perimeters, they posted sentries, they coordinated attacks, but they did it all in ways that suggested military or police training from their previous lives. If we could anticipate those patterns, if we could think like they thought, we might be able to stay ahead of their tactical evolution. The key was understanding that this wasn't a disease outbreak anymore. It was a war, fought by an enemy that had once been human, but was rapidly developing capabilities that exceeded normal human limitations. They had our knowledge, our training, our understanding of technology and infrastructure, but they also had enhanced physical capabilities, perfect night vision, and coordination that didn't require verbal communication. We were fighting a superior enemy with inferior numbers and limited resources. Our only advantages were mobility, creativity, and the ability to think in 3 dimensions. The scaffolding skills that had seemed like just another construction trade were becoming the foundation of a new kind of warfare. Every rope, every harness, every carabiner was a tactical asset that could mean the difference between life and death. Every building was a potential fortress if you knew how to access the upper levels safely. Every elevated position was a strategic advantage if you could reach it before the enemy could counter it. As we settled in for our second night, watching the infected continue their siege preparation at the abandoned construction site, I realized that day 2 had taught us the most important lesson of this new world. The old rules were completely useless. The enemy was evolving faster than we were adapting. Our survival depended not on fighting them directly, but on staying ahead of their learning curve, moving faster than they could coordinate responses, thinking in ways they couldn't anticipate. But even as we planned our next moves, I could see signs that they were developing new capabilities. The coordination between groups was getting more sophisticated. The construction projects were becoming more complex. The tactical planning was incorporating lessons learned from multiple encounters across vast distances. We were witnessing the birth of a new kind of intelligence, one that combined human knowledge with enhanced capabilities and perfect coordination. Day 3 was going to bring challenges that would test every survival skill we developed and every tactical advantage we discovered. The question wasn't whether we could survive another day. The question was whether we could evolve fast enough to stay ahead of an enemy that was becoming more dangerous with every passing hour. Night 2 taught me that everything we thought we knew about these things was wrong. They weren't just infected people anymore. They were becoming something else entirely. Something that made the red-eyed killers from day 1 look like amateurs. We'd positioned ourselves in what Jim called a hardened communications building, some kind of emergency services facility that had backup power and reinforced construction. Seemed like a smart choice until we realized we weren't the only ones who understood the strategic value of communication infrastructure. Around 2 in the morning, We started hearing them outside, but these weren't the random growls and clicking sounds we'd gotten used to. These were organized signals, coordinated communications that sounded almost like military radio chatter. I watched through reinforced windows as they deployed around our building. Not the chaotic swarming we'd seen before, but precise tactical positioning. Perimeter security, overwatch positions, coordinated entry teams. The whole setup looked like something out of a military manual. They'd learned not just from human tactics, but from human organizational structures. These weren't Class 2 infected anymore. Based on what we were seeing, they'd evolved into something the radio operators weren't even classifying yet. But here's what really got my attention. They were examining the building's construction, studying load-bearing walls, identifying weak points in the structure, planning their assault with the kind of technical knowledge that takes years to develop. One of them was actually carrying what looked like construction blueprints, referencing the documents while pointing out specific structural elements to the others. They were using our own building plans against us. Jim had rigged his radio equipment to monitor multiple emergency frequencies, and what we were hearing painted a picture that was beyond terrifying. Military units across the country were reporting coordinated attacks that suggested the infected had developed centralized command and control, not just local coordination, but strategic planning that spanned hundreds of miles. Supply convoys were being ambushed at precisely the right locations to maximize damage. Communication centers were being targeted in sequences that systematically isolated entire regions. Power grids were being sabotaged in patterns that created cascading failures across multiple states. The infected weren't just attacking randomly anymore. They were conducting strategic warfare with objectives that required long-term planning and resource allocation. Somewhere in their ranks, they had developed leadership structures capable of analyzing intelligence, planning operations, and coordinating execution across vast distances. The implications were staggering. We weren't just fighting local groups of infected. We were fighting an organized military force that was using our own infrastructure and knowledge against us. Around 4 in the morning, we got our first demonstration of their new capabilities. Instead of trying to break into the building through conventional entry points, they started systematically removing external utility connections. Power lines, communication cables, water pipes, all being carefully disconnected in ways that suggested they understood how building systems functioned. They weren't just cutting cables randomly. They were isolating us, cutting off our external resources while leaving the building structure intact. They wanted us alive, which was somehow more terrifying than the mindless aggression we'd experienced before. Jim managed to establish contact with the hospital group just before our communications went down. Their situation was even worse than ours. The infected inside the building weren't just destroying medical equipment anymore. They were operating it, using diagnostic machines, accessing computer systems, studying medical records with apparent understanding of what they were reading. The survivors reported seeing infected wearing hospital scrubs, moving through the facility with purpose and organization that suggested they retained professional knowledge from their previous lives. The grain elevator group had managed to reestablish contact through some kind of backup system, and their report was the most disturbing yet. The infected besieging their position were using construction equipment, not just crude tools or improvised weapons, but actual heavy machinery operated with skill and precision. Excavators, bulldozers, cranes, all being used in coordinated engineering operations that required technical training and years of experience. They were conducting siege warfare with industrial equipment, combining human knowledge with enhanced physical capabilities and perfect coordination. As dawn approached on day 3, we faced a reality that no one wanted to acknowledge. The infected weren't losing human knowledge when they turned. They were retaining professional skills, technical expertise, strategic thinking, all the capabilities that made human civilization possible. but they were applying that knowledge with enhanced physical abilities, perfect night vision, and coordination that didn't require verbal communication. We were fighting an enemy that had all our advantages plus capabilities we couldn't match. The communications building was no longer defensible, but leaving meant exposing ourselves to an enemy that could anticipate our tactics, counter our strategies, and coordinate responses faster than we could adapt. Jim suggested we split up, reasoning that smaller groups would be harder to track and coordinate against. But I'd seen how they were learning from our movement patterns, studying our techniques, preparing countermeasures for every tactical advantage we developed. Splitting up would just make us easier targets. The solution came from an unexpected source. Jim's 10-year-old daughter had been watching the infected through a small observation window, tracking their movements with the kind of attention to detail that only kids possess. She'd noticed something the adults had missed. The infected were avoiding certain areas of the building, specifically the sections where Jim had been testing his electrical equipment, not just staying away from active circuits, but avoiding areas where there had been electrical activity even hours earlier. Jim ran some quick tests and confirmed his daughter's observation. The infected were sensitive to electromagnetic fields in ways that normal humans weren't. High-voltage electrical activity seemed to interfere with their coordination, disrupting whatever communication method they were using. It wasn't a perfect defense, but it gave us a tactical advantage we could exploit. Jim started rigging electrical systems throughout our section of the building, creating electromagnetic barriers that forced the infected to approach through specific routes we could control. The escape from the communications building required everything we'd learned about their behavioral patterns and tactical thinking. Instead of trying to evade them, we used their own strategic mindset against them. Jim created electrical diversions that drew their attention to specific areas, while we extracted through routes they wouldn't expect us to use. The infected were thinking like military tacticians, which made their responses predictable if you understood military doctrine. We made it to our next position, a water treatment facility that offered both elevation and access to one of the few remaining clean water sources in the region. But during the move, I observed something that changed my entire understanding of what we were fighting. The infected weren't just coordinating locally anymore. They were receiving instructions from somewhere else, following orders that came from beyond their immediate area. I watched groups of them suddenly change direction, abandoning whatever they were doing to respond to signals that had to be coming from a centralized command structure. The water treatment plant turned out to be a strategic goldmine, not just because of the clean water, which was becoming more valuable than gold in this new world, but because the facility's elevated tank systems created perfect observation points and escape routes. From the top of the main storage tank, we could see infected movements across a 20-mile radius. What we observed confirmed our worst fears and revealed opportunities we hadn't considered. The infected were establishing permanent installations, not just camps or gathering points, but actual constructed facilities that served specific strategic purposes. Supply depots, communication centers, what looked like training facilities where newly infected were being organized and equipped. They were building the infrastructure of occupation, creating a parallel civilization that could sustain long-term operations against human survivors. But they were also making mistakes. Their strategic thinking was based on human military doctrine, which meant they followed predictable patterns that could be exploited if you understood the underlying principles. They established perimeters according to standard military protocols. They positioned Overwatch according to conventional tactics. They conducted operations using procedures that could be anticipated if you knew what to look for. Jim's radio equipment picked up something even more significant from our elevated position. Military communications that suggested organized human resistance was developing in areas that had been written off as completely overrun. Special forces units operating behind enemy lines, using unconventional tactics that exploited the infected's reliance on conventional military thinking. Civilian groups learning to use asymmetric warfare against an enemy that was stronger but more predictable than they initially appeared. The water treatment facility also gave us access to detailed maps of regional infrastructure that revealed patterns in the infected strategic targeting. They were systematically destroying transportation networks, but in specific sequences that suggested they understood economic and logistical principles. They weren't just cutting roads and bridges randomly. They were isolating economic centers, disrupting supply chains, forcing survivors into resource-dependent positions that could be controlled or eliminated. During our second day at the water facility, we established contact with a group that changed everything we thought we knew about survival possibilities. A National Guard unit that had been cut off during the initial outbreak, but had managed to maintain unit cohesion and tactical effectiveness. They'd been observing infected behavior from multiple positions across several states, collecting intelligence that painted a comprehensive picture of what we were really fighting. According to their intelligence, the infected retained not just individual knowledge and skills, but institutional memory. Military units that turned were maintaining command structures. Medical teams were continuing to function as organized units. Engineering groups were conducting coordinated construction projects. The infected weren't just individuals with enhanced capabilities. They were organized professions with enhanced capabilities, which explained the sophisticated tactics and strategic planning we'd been observing. But the National Guard intelligence also revealed vulnerabilities that could be exploited. The infected's reliance on institutional knowledge made them predictable in certain situations. Their enhanced coordination was dependent on electromagnetic communication that could be disrupted. Their strategic planning was based on pre-outbreak intelligence that was becoming outdated as survivors adapted to new tactics and technologies. Most importantly, the National Guard had developed countermeasures that were proving effective in limited engagements. Electromagnetic warfare that disrupted infected coordination. Asymmetric tactics that exploited their predictable strategic thinking. Infrastructure operations that turned their own construction projects against them. The war was far from over, and organized resistance was not only possible, but beginning to show tactical successes. The water facility became our base for establishing contact with other survivor groups and coordinating intelligence sharing. My scaffolding expertise was crucial for creating secure communication networks that couldn't be easily detected or disrupted by infected forces. Every zip line, every elevated pathway, every climbing route became part of a communication infrastructure that allowed isolated groups to share intelligence and coordinate operations. But we were also getting intelligence that suggested the infected were continuing to evolve. Reports of infected using radio equipment, operating computer systems, coordinating with aerial reconnaissance that suggested they had access to aircraft. The electromagnetic sensitivity that Jim's daughter had discovered was already being countered in some areas. The infected were adapting faster than we were developing countermeasures. By the third day at the water facility, we were tracking infected movements that suggested they were preparing for something major. Large-scale troop movements, supply concentrations, construction projects that looked like they were building infrastructure for massive operations. The radio chatter from military units suggested similar preparations were being observed across the country. Whatever was coming, it was going to be bigger and more coordinated than anything we'd seen so far. That's when we received the transmission that changed everything. A coordinated call for assistance from multiple survivor groups in the downtown area. Not just random people asking for help, but organized communities that had established sustainable positions and were offering to coordinate a major rescue operation. They had resources, equipment, and manpower that could make a real difference in helping isolated survivors and disrupting infected operations. The decision to respond to that call meant abandoning our secure position and entering the most dangerous operational environment we'd encountered. Downtown areas were heavily controlled by infected forces, and attempting a rescue operation would expose us to coordinated responses from multiple directions. But it also offered the possibility of connecting with organized resistance that could provide resources and capabilities we couldn't develop on our own. Jim ran calculations on the electromagnetic disruption equipment he'd been developing, trying to determine whether we could create enough interference to disrupt infected coordination during a major operation. The mathematics were complicated, but his initial analysis suggested that properly positioned electrical systems could create communication dead zones that would give us tactical advantages during specific types of operations. The kids had been practicing with climbing equipment daily, and their skills had developed to the point where they could navigate our elevated root systems as efficiently as adults. In the new world, those weren't just recreational activities. They were combat skills that could mean the difference between successful operations and catastrophic failure. The 8-year-old could now rappel down 50-foot drops with complete confidence. The 10-year-old could set up emergency zip lines faster than most adult climbers. As we prepared for what could be the most dangerous operation we'd attempted, the radio traffic painted a picture of infected forces massing for major operations across multiple regions. Whatever they were planning, it was coordinated on a scale that suggested national-level strategic planning. The rescue operation downtown might be our last opportunity to connect with organized resistance before the infected launched whatever massive operation they were preparing. The intelligence we'd gathered at the water facility would be crucial for planning the downtown operation. We knew their communication methods, their tactical preferences, their strategic vulnerabilities. We had electromagnetic countermeasures that could disrupt their coordination. We had mobility advantages that could be exploited if we planned our movements carefully. Most importantly, we had learned to think like they thought, to anticipate their responses, to use their own predictable behavior against them. But we were also racing against time. Every day brought new evidence of infected tactical evolution. Every operation taught them more about our capabilities and countermeasures. Every engagement gave them opportunities to develop new responses to our tactics. The window for successful resistance operations was closing, and we had to move fast if we wanted to maintain any tactical advantages. The downtown rescue operation would test everything we'd learned about survival, tactical planning, and coordinated resistance. It would determine whether organized human resistance could survive against an enemy that combined human intelligence with enhanced capabilities and perfect coordination. Most importantly, it would determine whether the skills and knowledge that had made human civilization possible could be adapted to ensure human survival in a world where the ground belonged to an enemy that had once been us. What happened next would prove that sometimes the most dangerous plan is the only one that works. But first, we had to survive what I can only describe as construction demolition gone completely insane. Everything I learned in 16 years of construction told me this plan would kill us all. Everything I learned in 3 days of survival told me it was our only chance. The call had come through on Jim's radio equipment just after dawn on day 3. Multiple survivor groups downtown were coordinating what they called Operation Lifeline, a massive rescue effort to extract isolated people from infected controlled territory. They had resources we'd only dreamed of: military-grade communication equipment, heavy construction machinery, even some kind of electromagnetic warfare capabilities that could disrupt infected coordination on a large scale. But they needed people with specialized skills to make it work, and my scaffolding expertise was exactly what they were looking for. The transmission came from someone identifying himself as Colonel Martinez, apparently a National Guard officer who'd managed to maintain unit cohesion during the initial outbreak. His group had established a secure base in the downtown financial district, using the elevated walkway systems between buildings to create what he called a three-dimensional fortress. They'd been monitoring our radio traffic for 2 days, tracking our movements, analyzing our tactical innovations. They wanted to incorporate our electromagnetic disruption techniques and elevated mobility systems into a coordinated operation that could extract hundreds of survivors while simultaneously disrupting infected command and control infrastructure. Jim ran the numbers on what they were proposing, and the mathematics were staggering. Coordinated electromagnetic interference across a 20-block radius, simultaneous rescue operations at 15 different locations, and systematic demolition of infected supply depots and communication centers. The operation would require precise timing, perfect coordination, and tactical execution that left no room for error. One mistake could doom not just our small group, but hundreds of people who were counting on the rescue operation for survival. But the intelligence they shared painted a picture that made the risks worthwhile. The infected were indeed preparing for something massive, what Colonel Martinez called a consolidation operation. Intelligence suggested they were planning to eliminate all remaining survivor enclaves within a 100-mile radius, using coordinated attacks that would overwhelm any fixed defensive positions. The downtown rescue operation might be the last opportunity to extract people before the infected launched their final push to eliminate organized human resistance in the region. The plan required us to move through 15 miles of infected-controlled territory to reach the downtown staging area. Not just any territory, but zones where the infected had established permanent installations, supply depots, and what appeared to be command centers. Jim's electromagnetic equipment would be crucial for creating communication dead zones that could mask our movement. But the devices were bulky, fragile, and required power sources that would slow us down and make us more visible. I spent 6 hours planning our route using topographical maps, construction site surveys, and infrastructure blueprints that Jim had collected from various sources. The key was maintaining elevation whenever possible, using building tops, construction cranes, communication towers, anything that kept us above the infected patrol patterns. My scaffolding knowledge was essential for identifying structures that could support our weight, calculating load distributions for temporary bridge systems, and determining which buildings offered the best anchor points for climbing equipment. The kids had become essential members of our tactical team, rather than just people we were protecting. The 8-year-old had developed an intuitive understanding of rope systems that rivaled adult climbers. The 10-year-old could spot structural weaknesses in buildings that even experienced construction workers might miss. Their smaller size and lighter weight made them ideal for reconnaissance missions that would be impossible for adults. In this new world, traditional ideas about protecting children had evolved into recognizing that survival required everyone to contribute whatever capabilities they possessed. Jim's wife had been monitoring radio traffic during our planning phase, and the intelligence she gathered was both encouraging and terrifying. Other survivor groups were reporting successful small-scale operations using tactics similar to what we'd developed. Electromagnetic disruption was proving effective against infected coordination. Elevated movement systems were allowing survivors to operate in territory that had been written off as completely lost. But the infected were adapting faster than expected, developing countermeasures that reduced the effectiveness of previously successful tactics. The first phase of our movement went exactly according to plan. Jim's electromagnetic equipment created interference patterns that forced infected patrols to alter their routes, giving us windows of opportunity to move between elevated positions. My climbing gear allowed us to traverse gaps between buildings that would have been impossible to cross at ground level. The family's coordination had improved dramatically over our 3 days together, and they moved through the elevated route system with efficiency that would have impressed professional rescue teams. But around the halfway point to downtown, we encountered something that changed everything we thought we understood about infected capabilities. A construction site that had been completely reorganized, not just occupied but systematically rebuilt, according to engineering principles that exceeded anything we'd seen before. Multi-story structures that incorporated advanced architectural concepts, power generation systems that suggested sophisticated understanding of electrical engineering, communication arrays that looked like they could coordinate operations across hundreds of miles. The infected weren't just retaining human knowledge anymore. They were advancing it, building on pre-outbreak technologies in ways that created capabilities that normal humans couldn't match. The construction site looked like a research and development facility, with different sections dedicated to specific types of technological innovation. Weapons development, communication enhancement, construction techniques that could create fortified positions faster and more efficiently than anything human engineers had developed. Jim's equipment detected electromagnetic signatures from the site that were unlike anything he'd encountered. Not just communication traffic, but what appeared to be data transmission on frequencies, and in patterns that suggested they were networking their knowledge, sharing technological innovations between different infected groups in real time. The implications were staggering. If they could share knowledge instantaneously across vast distances, they could adapt to new threats and develop countermeasures faster than human resistance could develop new tactics. We had to detour around the construction site, adding 3 hours to our movement time and forcing us to traverse territory that our intelligence suggested was heavily patrolled. But the detour revealed something that made the extra risk worthwhile. The infected were concentrating their advanced facilities in specific locations, leaving other areas with reduced security and surveillance. Their technological capabilities required infrastructure that created vulnerabilities we could exploit if we understood their operational patterns. The electromagnetic interference from Jim's equipment was becoming less effective as we got closer to downtown. The infected were deploying countermeasures that reduced the impact of our disruption techniques, forcing us to rely more heavily on stealth and tactical movement than electronic warfare. But they were also making mistakes, following predictable patterns that suggested their countermeasures were based on assumptions about our capabilities that weren't entirely accurate. When we reached the outer perimeter of the downtown area, the scope of what Colonel Martinez had accomplished became clear. The survivor base wasn't just a few people hiding in buildings. It was an organized military operation that had established secure territory, functional infrastructure, and tactical capabilities that could challenge infected control of urban areas. Elevated walkways connected dozens of buildings, creating a three-dimensional fortress that provided both defensive advantages and operational flexibility. But the radio traffic we were monitoring suggested that infected forces were massing for a major assault on the downtown survivor base. Not just local troops, but coordinated forces from across the region that were converging for what appeared to be a decisive engagement. The rescue operation wasn't just about extracting isolated survivors anymore. It was about evacuating the entire downtown base before it was overrun by forces that outnumbered the defenders by orders of magnitude. Colonel Martinez met us at the perimeter checkpoint, and his intelligence briefing revealed the true scope of what we were facing. The infected had developed what he called distributed command and control, leadership structures that could coordinate operations across multiple states without relying on centralized communication systems that could be disrupted or destroyed. Local commanders had operational autonomy, but shared strategic intelligence through networks that functioned more like internet protocols than traditional military communication. The rescue operation he was planning represented the largest coordinated human resistance effort since the initial outbreak. 15 extraction teams operating simultaneously across the downtown area, supported by electromagnetic warfare that would disrupt infected coordination and construction demolition that would eliminate their staging areas. My scaffolding expertise would be crucial for the extraction teams, providing the elevated mobility systems that could move large numbers of people safely through infected controlled territory. But the operation also represented an enormous risk. If it failed, the infected would eliminate the largest concentration of organized resistance in the region and capture equipment and personnel that could provide intelligence about human tactical capabilities. The electromagnetic warfare techniques that Jim had developed would be compromised. The construction demolition methods that I was planning to use would be analyzed and countered. Future resistance operations would face an enemy that understood our capabilities and had developed specific countermeasures. The planning phase revealed just how much the tactical situation had evolved since the initial outbreak. The infected weren't just mindless, aggressive forces anymore. They were conducting intelligence operations, analyzing human resistance tactics, developing countermeasures that were specifically designed to defeat our most effective survival strategies. Every operation taught them more about our capabilities, and they were learning faster than we were developing new techniques. Jim's electromagnetic equipment had to be completely reconfigured to work with the military-grade systems that Colonel Martinez had available. The integration was complex, requiring technical knowledge that pushed both men to the limits of their expertise. But the combined system would create interference patterns that could disrupt infected coordination across the entire downtown area, giving the extraction teams tactical advantages that might make the difference between success and catastrophic failure. The construction demolition plan I developed required precise timing and coordination that left no room for error. Strategic demolition of key structures could create barriers that would slow infected response to the rescue operation, while simultaneously destroying supply depots and communication centers that supported their regional operations. But the demolition had to be executed in specific sequences that would maximize tactical advantage while minimizing risk to civilian survivors and extraction teams. During the final planning phase, we received intelligence that changed everything about the operation. The infected weren't just massing forces for an assault on the downtown base. They were coordinating similar operations across multiple regions, apparently planning to eliminate organized human resistance simultaneously across hundreds of miles. The downtown rescue operation was no longer an isolated tactical engagement. It was part of a strategic conflict that would determine whether human resistance could survive the final infected push for total territorial control. The kids were assigned to one of the extraction teams, not as passengers, but as essential team members whose climbing skills and small size made them ideal for specific types of rescue operations. The 8-year-old would be responsible for establishing initial rope systems in buildings where adult climbers couldn't safely access anchor points. The 10-year-old would coordinate communication between elevated positions and ground-level extraction teams. Their parents were terrified, but they also understood that in this new world, everyone had to contribute whatever capabilities they possessed. As the operation moved into final preparation, the radio traffic painted a picture of infected forces that were unlike anything we'd encountered before. Coordinated military formations that included heavy equipment, air support, and what appeared to be specialized assault units trained for urban combat operations. The infected weren't just using human knowledge anymore. They were advancing human military capabilities in ways that created tactical advantages we couldn't match with conventional resistance techniques. The electromagnetic warfare systems were tested one final time, and the results were both encouraging and concerning. The interference patterns could disrupt infected coordination, but only for limited periods before their adaptive systems developed countermeasures. We would have windows of tactical advantage, but those windows were measured in minutes rather than hours. Every phase of the operation had to be executed with precision timing that allowed number delays or tactical adjustments. The construction demolition equipment was positioned according to plans that had been reviewed, and reviewed by everyone with engineering expertise. The explosives were military-grade, carefully calculated to create maximum disruption of infected infrastructure, while minimizing collateral damage to extraction routes and civilian areas. But the demolition sequences required manual activation from positions that would be exposed to infected forces, meaning someone had to stay behind to ensure the explosives functioned according to plan. Colonel Martinez made it clear that the extraction teams had specific objectives and couldn't be diverted to help anyone who volunteered for demolition duties. The operation was too large and too complex to risk compromising multiple extraction routes for individual personnel. Anyone who volunteered for demolition assignments was accepting that they might not survive to participate in the evacuation. It was a harsh calculation, but the mathematics of survival in the New World didn't allow for sentiment or individual preferences. As dawn approached on what would be the most dangerous day since the outbreak began, the final intelligence reports painted a picture of infected forces that were positioned for decisive engagement. This wasn't just another tactical skirmish or local operation. This was the battle that would determine whether organized human resistance could survive, whether the skills and knowledge that had built human civilization could be adapted to ensure human survival in a world where the ground belonged to an enemy that had once been us. The operation would test everything we'd learned about survival, tactical planning, electromagnetic warfare, and construction demolition. It would determine whether the abilities that had made us successful construction workers and electrical technicians could be transformed into the capabilities needed to win a war against an enemy that combined human intelligence with enhanced physical capabilities and perfect coordination. What happened next proved that sometimes doing the right thing is the stupidest thing you can possibly do. But sometimes stupid is the only thing that separates us from those monsters down there. The controlled demolition began at exactly 6 in the morning, and for 30 seconds, everything went according to plan. Jim's electromagnetic warfare systems created communication, dead zones across the downtown area, just as the first charges detonated in the infected supply depot 3 blocks north of our position. The explosion wasn't random destruction. It was precisely calculated structural failure that brought down a converted warehouse complex the infected had been using to coordinate regional operations. Colonel Martinez had been right about the psychological impact. The infected forces that had been massing for their assault on our base suddenly found themselves cut off from central coordination, isolated in small groups that couldn't communicate with each other or receive orders from their command structure. For those first few minutes, we had the tactical advantage we'd been planning for. The extraction teams moved out simultaneously, heading for 15 different survivor locations, while the infected were still trying to understand what had happened to their communication networks. I was positioned on top of the Peachtree Financial Building, with the manual detonation controls for the second phase demolition. From my elevated position, I could see the entire operation unfolding across the downtown area. Extraction teams rappelling down building faces to reach trapped survivors. Zip line systems carrying people between rooftops, while infected forces struggled to coordinate responses from ground level. The electromagnetic interference was working exactly as planned, creating windows of tactical opportunity that our teams were exploiting with precision timing. But 16 years of construction experience had taught me to watch for the signs that indicate when a plan is about to go wrong. The infected weren't just confused by the loss of communication. They were adapting, falling back on backup coordination methods that didn't rely on the electromagnetic frequencies we were disrupting. I watched groups of them establishing visual communication systems, using reflected light signals that could coordinate movement without radio traffic. They were learning faster than our operational timeline had anticipated. The second phase demolition was supposed to target the converted parking structure the infected had turned into a vehicle maintenance facility. Intelligence suggested they were using it to service heavy construction equipment and military vehicles they'd captured from overrun positions. Destroying the facility would eliminate their mechanized capabilities and force them to rely on infantry tactics that our elevated mobility systems could counter more effectively. But as I prepared to trigger the charges, I realized the infected had anticipated our demolition strategy. They'd moved most of their vehicles out of the facility during the night, dispersing them to secondary locations that our intelligence hadn't identified. The parking structure was now being used as a staging area for what looked like hundreds of infected personnel, all positioned where the demolition would eliminate them as a threat. They were using our own tactical plan against us, turning our demolition into an opportunity to remove large numbers of their forces from the engagement. The mathematics of the situation were brutal. If I triggered the demolition as planned, we'd eliminate a major concentration of infected forces, but lose the strategic advantage of destroying their mechanized capabilities. If I didn't trigger the demolition, those forces would be available to respond to our extraction operations, potentially overwhelming our teams before they could complete their missions. Either choice carried enormous risks, and I had about 30 seconds to make a decision that could determine the outcome of the entire operation. Jim's voice came through the radio with an update that changed everything. His electromagnetic monitoring equipment was detecting new communication frequencies that the infected were using to coordinate their response. Not just backup systems, but entirely new types of signals that suggested they'd developed communication technologies that exceeded our countermeasure capabilities. The electromagnetic interference that had given us our initial advantage was becoming less effective with each passing minute. I triggered the second phase demolition, watching the parking structure collapse in precisely the sequence I'd calculated. But instead of eliminating infected forces, the demolition revealed something that made my blood run cold. The infected had been using the structure as a decoy, filling it with personnel who were already injured or non-functional. The real combat forces had been positioned in concealed locations around the demolition site, waiting for us to reveal our capabilities before launching their counterattack. The extraction teams were reporting successful rescues at multiple locations, but they were also encountering infected forces that seemed to know exactly where they were going and what routes they were using. The infected weren't just responding to our operations. They were anticipating them, positioning forces to intercept extraction teams at precisely the right locations to maximize casualties. Somehow, they had obtained intelligence about our operational plans, either through surveillance we hadn't detected or through sources we hadn't considered. Colonel Martinez came on the radio with a situation report that confirmed our worst fears. The infected forces massing around the downtown area weren't just coordinating locally. They were receiving real-time intelligence from observation posts positioned throughout the region, creating a surveillance network that could track our movements and predict our tactical decisions. The electromagnetic warfare that was supposed to blind them was only affecting their short-range communication. Their strategic intelligence gathering was still fully functional. The third phase demolition was supposed to create escape routes for the extraction teams by bringing down specific structures that would block infected pursuit routes, while opening corridors that led to our elevated evacuation systems. But the infected had positioned forces along those exact corridors, turning our escape routes into kill zones where our people would be trapped between collapsed buildings and coordinated enemy fire. I had to make a choice that violated every operational protocol Colonel Martinez had established. Instead of triggering the third phase as planned, I started improvising demolition sequences that would create entirely different tactical opportunities. Using my construction knowledge to calculate alternative structural failures that could disrupt infected positioning, while creating new escape routes that weren't part of our original operational plan. The improvised demolition required manual placement of charges in locations that were exposed to infected fire. But it was the only way to create the tactical flexibility our extraction teams needed. I rappelled down from the Peachtree building using climbing gear that hadn't been tested for combat operations, moving between structures while infected forces tried to coordinate responses to targets they couldn't predict because I was making up the plan as I went. Jim's electromagnetic equipment was detecting communication patterns that suggested the infected were bringing in reinforcements from positions outside the downtown area. Not just local forces, but coordinated units from across the region that were converging on our location with timing that indicated central planning and strategic coordination. The operation wasn't just facing local resistance anymore. It was dealing with a regional response that threatened to overwhelm our capabilities regardless of how successful the individual extractions might be. The extraction teams were reporting situations that defied everything we thought we understood about infected behavior. Survivors who had been rescued were providing information about infected forces that suggested they were conducting psychological operations, using captured humans to provide false intelligence about safe locations and escape routes. Some of the people we were rescuing might be infected personnel who retained enough human appearance to infiltrate our operations. But the most disturbing reports came from the teams operating in the financial district. They were encountering infected forces that were using captured military equipment with skill levels that exceeded normal human capabilities. Not just operating the equipment, but maintaining it, modifying it, improving it in ways that suggested they understood the underlying technologies well enough to advance them beyond original specifications. The fourth phase demolition had to be completely redesigned based on the tactical situation that was developing in real time. Instead of creating large-scale structural failures, I started using precise charges to create targeted barriers and obstacles that could channel infected movement while providing cover for our extraction operations. The approach required more manual placement and greater exposure to enemy fire, but it offered tactical flexibility that couldn't be countered as easily as our original demolition plan. Colonel Martinez was coordinating the overall operation from his command post, but the radio traffic suggested that even his experienced tactical thinking was being challenged by infected capabilities that exceeded normal military responses. The infected weren't just fighting like human military units anymore. They were fighting like human military units that had enhanced physical capabilities, perfect coordination, and access to intelligence gathering that normal humans couldn't match. The kids were performing beyond anything their parents had thought possible. The 8-year-old had established rope systems in 3 different buildings, enabling extraction operations that saved dozens of people who would have been impossible to reach through conventional rescue methods. The 10-year-old was coordinating communication between extraction teams and the command post, processing information and relaying tactical updates with accuracy that impressed even experienced military personnel. But the operation was also revealing the true scope of what we were fighting. The infected weren't just local forces that had retained human knowledge. They were part of a distributed intelligence network that could coordinate strategic operations across hundreds of miles, while simultaneously conducting tactical operations that required real-time adaptation to changing battlefield conditions. We were fighting an enemy that combined human intelligence with capabilities that exceeded human limitations. As the morning progressed, the extraction operations were succeeding in rescuing survivors, but the cost was becoming prohibitive. Extraction teams were taking casualties from infected forces that seemed to anticipate every tactical move. The electromagnetic warfare that had given us our initial advantage was being countered by adaptive systems that learned from each interference pattern. The demolition operations were creating tactical opportunities, but they were also revealing our capabilities to an enemy that was analyzing everything we did and developing countermeasures faster than we could develop new tactics. The final phase of the operation required a decision that none of us wanted to make. The infected forces were converging on the downtown area in numbers that would overwhelm our defensive capabilities within hours. The extraction operations had rescued hundreds of people, but evacuating them safely would require tactical sacrifices that could eliminate our ability to conduct future resistance operations. Someone had to stay behind to ensure the evacuation routes remained open long enough for the survivors to escape. I volunteered for the rear guard assignment, not because I was more expendable than anyone else, but because my construction knowledge made me the most effective person for conducting the kind of demolition operations that could delay the infected advance while maximizing the time available for evacuation. The mathematics were brutal but clear. The knowledge and equipment I could apply to creating obstacles and barriers could buy more time for more people than any other tactical approach. Jim and his family were evacuated with the first group of survivors, taking his electromagnetic warfare equipment to ensure that future resistance operations would have access to the countermeasures he'd developed. The kids protested being separated from the operation, but their climbing skills and communication abilities were too valuable to risk in a rear guard action that had minimal chances of survival. Colonel Martinez coordinated the evacuation with military precision, but even his experience couldn't hide the fact that we were conducting a strategic retreat from territory. We couldn't hold against an enemy that was stronger, more numerous, and better coordinated than anything human military doctrine had prepared for. The operation was succeeding in its immediate objectives, but it was also demonstrating that conventional resistance tactics weren't sufficient for long-term survival against infected forces. The final demolition sequences I implemented were designed not just to create obstacles, but to destroy the infrastructure that the infected had been using to coordinate regional operations. Communication centers, supply depots, vehicle maintenance facilities, all systematically eliminated in ways that would force them to rebuild their operational capabilities from basic components. It wouldn't stop them permanently, but it would slow them down enough to give human resistance time to develop new tactics and technologies. As the last evacuation group disappeared into the elevated route system that would carry them to safety, I found myself alone in downtown territory that would soon be completely controlled by infected forces. But the 3 days of survival experience had taught me that being alone didn't mean being helpless. My construction knowledge, climbing equipment, and understanding of infected behavioral patterns gave me capabilities that could ensure survival even in the most hostile operational environment. The infected forces that moved into the downtown area after the evacuation revealed the true scope of their organizational capabilities. Military formations that included specialized units for different types of operations. Engineering teams that immediately began analyzing the demolished structures to understand the techniques we'd used. Intelligence personnel who started systematic searches for any information we might have left behind. This wasn't just an occupying force. It was a complete military organization that could control territory, analyze threats, and develop countermeasures with efficiency that exceeded normal human capabilities. But they were also making mistakes that could be exploited by someone who understood their operational patterns. Their reliance on systematic procedures made their responses predictable. Their emphasis on controlling territory created vulnerabilities in areas they considered secured. Their assumption that individual survivors posed minimal threats led to security protocols that could be circumvented by someone with the right knowledge and equipment. Over the following weeks, I used my elevated mobility systems to establish contact with other resistance groups that were developing across the region. The downtown evacuation had been more successful than anyone had dared hope, not just in rescuing survivors, but in demonstrating that coordinated human resistance could achieve tactical victories against infected forces. The techniques we developed were being adapted and improved by groups across multiple states. The electromagnetic warfare capabilities that Jim had developed were being integrated into resistance operations that could disrupt infected coordination on scales we'd never attempted before. The construction demolition methods I'd pioneered were being used to eliminate infected infrastructure while creating defensive advantages for human forces. The elevated mobility systems that had started as simple scaffolding techniques were becoming the foundation for a new kind of warfare that could challenge infected control of urban territory. But the infected were also evolving, developing new capabilities that countered every tactical advantage human resistance had achieved. Enhanced coordination systems that couldn't be disrupted by electromagnetic interference. Construction techniques that created fortified positions faster than human demolition could eliminate them. Intelligence gathering that could anticipate resistance operations and prepare countermeasures before attacks were launched. The war was far from over, but the downtown operation had proved that human resistance wasn't just possible but potentially effective if the right tactics and technologies could be developed and coordinated. The knowledge and skills that had built human civilization could be adapted to ensure human survival, but only if we could evolve as fast as the enemy was evolving. 3 days after the downtown evacuation, I established a permanent base in the elevated systems between the tallest buildings in the region. Not just a hiding place, but an operational center that could coordinate resistance activities while providing the kind of mobility and tactical flexibility that conventional fixed positions couldn't offer. The construction knowledge that had once been used to build scaffolding for renovation projects was now being used to build scaffolding for the reconstruction of human civilization. I used to build scaffolding to help construct buildings. Now I build it to help reconstruct hope. The ground may belong to them now, but as long as we can climb higher, think smarter, and work together, we can survive anything, even this. The skills that made us successful in the old world can be adapted to ensure our survival in the new world. Every tool, every technique, every piece of knowledge we've accumulated over generations of human progress can be transformed into weapons and defenses that give us advantages the infected can't anticipate or counter. We're not just fighting for survival anymore. We're fighting for the future of human civilization, and we're going to win.